sound plan. Of course. For my father, the king. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Is there danger? A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Certainly. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
Spree double kill.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. You are passed. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Our brethren's
Of course.
town is under attack.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Justice is there.
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. The light is my strength.
Our brethren's town is under
A
attack.
sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? A sound plan. For Lordaeron. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Dominating.
A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Foul. A sound plan.
Our brethren's
honor.
town is under attack.
For honor. A sound plan. For my father.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For my father, the king. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. The light.
Mega kill.
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Betrayal of light.
For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Justice.
Of course. A sound plan.
Can I help you?
The light is my strength. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Unstoppable.
For honor.
You are powerful.
Of course.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. You are past death. For my father, the king. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
You are past betrayer of light.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Of course.
Foul name. You are past that.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Justice is come. For my father.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
For Lord Oran.
A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Foul name.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For my father. A sound plan. Of course.
Feel my wrath. Justice is come. Betrayer of light.
For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Foul name.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
Betrayer of light. Feel my wrath. Justice.
Of course. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
For honor. I stand for the light.
time. Look around.
Justice. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our refuge town is under attack.
A sound plan.
Foul name.
For honor.
Double
A sound
kill.
plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Is there danger? For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
Justice is come.
Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. Is there danger?
Hello.
The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly. For my father, the king. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger?
Our refuge town is under attack.
For honor.
Betrayer of light.
The light is my strength. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor.
Foul name.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
How can I help?
Is there danger? I stand for the light. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Stand for the light.
Betrayer of light.
Certainly. Of course.
Our refuge town is under attack. Feel my wrath.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
For my father, the king.
Of course.
Curse or magic.
A sound
Killing spree.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Welcome to our village. There's no time to rest.
The light is my strength. For honor.
Feel my wrath. Justice is come.
A sound plan. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
Foul. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
The Blood Elves await.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Yes.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
I stand for the light. Of course. A sound. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Justice is come.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Life is my strength. Certainly. For my father. I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
I thirst for magic.
Our
The Blood
brethren's
Elves
town is
await.
under attack.
How can I help?
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. The light is my strength. Is there danger? A sound plan.
Be
I'm
quick.
here to help.
Time is mana.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Foul name. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
Of course. Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. For honor. Certainly. For honor. The light
Our
is my
brethren's
strength.
town is under attack.
Certainly. Justice. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound. I'm here to help. Of course.
Killing spree.
Is there danger? Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. For my father.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Justice has come. Certainly. You are past protection. For my father, the king. A sound plan. For certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
You are past protection. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. Foul name. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Greetings, my lord. Show me the path.
A sound plan. For my father, the king. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Killing spree.
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For honor. Of course.
Killing spree. Double kill.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Foul knave. Justice has come. Foul. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. The light is my strength. For honor.
I thirst for
Is
mastery.
there danger?
Yes.
Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's
course.
town is under attack.
I stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Thy bidding,
Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. The light is my strength. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course. The light is my strength. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Our
A sound
brethren's
plan.
town is under attack.
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A
Our
sound plan.
brethren's town is under attack.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Dominating.
Justice has come. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. Certainly.
Mega
sound
double kill.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Double kill.
Of course. Certainly.
Unstoppable. Triple kill.
Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Betrayer of light.
Certainly. For honor.
Justice is come.
Certainly. For my father. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan.
Hello.
is my aid required.
Of course. I'm here to help.
is required.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. For Lord Oran.
Wicked sick.
For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan.
Unstoppable.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
Unstoppable. Double kill.
A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan.
Not enough.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger? Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Foul name.
A sound plan.
Justice is coming.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
Of course. Is there danger? For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
The Blood Elves await.
Certainly. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Justice shall be done. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly.
I bow to
Is there
your
danger?
will.
I stand for the light. Is there danger? A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Justice is done. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Justice is coming.
Certainly. For honor.
Killing spree.
Certain magic. For my father. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Justice shall be done.
Betrayer of the light. Feel my
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. What is your wish? I stand for the light. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. Of course. For honor.
Monster kill!